So I'm Peter Frazier, Associate Professor in the School of Operations Research and Information Engineering at Cornell University. And I'm pleased to be able to interview Dr. Christine Shoemaker, who's a distinguished professor at National University of Singapore. And we spent several years together at Cornell University when I joined as a junior faculty, and she has spent many more years there than I have. So, do you want to tell me about where you're from and your early life?
Okay, so my parents were intelligent people, but they grew up as children in the Depression. They were were not well educated. My dear mother was pulled out of school when she was 12 years old, so she never even got to go to high school, for which she was embarrassed all of her life. And so I didn't have a strong academic background at all at home, but for some reason, when I was about 10 years old, I decided I wanted to get a PhD in nuclear physics. I don't know where that came from. I suppose there was Sputnik and all that was going on at the time. And possibly it was because my mother's lack of education made me really appreciate the value of education. And so then I got a real break, since actually when I was young, I think my parents separated, and my mother was very poor. Although I was a little kid, all I cared about was being with my mother. I didn't feel disadvantaged at all, didn't feel unhappy as a child. But then when it came time to go to college, I was very lucky that I got a very generous fellowship or scholarship from the University of California, Davis. And so that just changed my whole life. That went entirely huge. For that, I'm just extremely grateful. And so I got interested in mathematics, and I loved the purity of mathematics. I loved theorems and how everything was so clearly stated. And then my junior year, I went to Germany. I studied in Germany, studied mathematics in German, which was a challenge. But Germany had a tremendous impact on me, because it shakes up your whole life. The things you've assumed you know about what life is like is very different when you go to a different country. And at that time, I was still very aware of World War II, and I met all these really nice German people, and yet there had been this horrible things that had happened during World War II. And so over the course of the year, I gradually began to feel like, well, the real problem was that most people, the nice people, were not politically involved. And then things got out of hand, and Hitler just was able to take over. And so I thought, well, it's really important, if you're a citizen, to participate in the politics of your country. And also at the same time, when I was in Germany, the United States was in Vietnam, and when I always thought the United States always did everything perfectly and kindly and so forth. And then being in Europe, I got a different view that maybe their being in Vietnam was not such a good thing at all. And so the two things together, both just the feeling like people needed to be politically involved, and then the fact that there was this war going on, really transformed me into a social protester against the Vietnam War. And when I came back to the United States to finish my last year, was just the beginning of the free speech movement that started in Berkeley.
And what year was that?
That was 65.
Okay.
And so I started getting involved in that, and then I was graduating, and I was also applying for math programs, and I had originally planned to do something really quite theoretical, like mathematical logic. I thought I loved the logic aspects of mathematics. But because of my social activism, I got much more of the feeling that, well, I really want to do something that's going to help society. And doing really theoretical mathematics is kind of like playing chess. It's wonderful, it's exciting, but it's not what I want to do for my life. So I started looking around for graduate programs that were more applied, and it was recommended that I apply to Richard Bellman, who at that point was very famous for his many, many papers and his work on dynamic programming, which Peter knows very well. And he accepted me, and I also got some other good offers, but I really feel at the time that there was discrimination against women being admitted to graduate programs, because I saw it when I went to Cornell later. I think male professors it wasn't they thought women weren't smart enough, it was that they thought they wouldn't stick with it. They'd get a PhD and then they would leave.
Yeah.
So it was really an affirmative action for someone as famous as Richard Bellman to have accepted me for a student. And I think, and he did many other things that were really supportive of affirmative action. So I think he should get credit for that, and I don't think a lot of people know about that.
Did he have other students that you felt?
He later had another woman student, but he also, more surprisingly, had 2 African American students, and so that was even more rare at that time.
And did you, like, if you felt that social activism was important, why get a PhD? Why not? Did you feel that mathematics was, somehow a part of that, or that you? What was your motivation in doing that instead of doing something else?
That's a good question. In retrospect, I probably should have gotten a PhD in computer science or electrical engineering,
or maybe not gotten a PhD at all. I don't know.
Possibly, yes. Well, I was pretty oriented towards a PhD, I think. just because I had no practicing engineers in my family, I didn't know what they did, but yeah, I think that what happens is if you ask mathematicians, well, should I, change fields? They say, oh no, if you know mathematics, you can do anything, right? And so that's what I thought, and it was only later that I realized it would have been pretty useful to have learned, something more about environmental chemistry and hydrology and stuff. So that was kind of why I stuck with math. And then once I was in the math PhD program, maybe 2 or 3 years into it, I began to realize the situation. But by then, you're almost to a degree, so I went ahead and finished it.
And I don't know a lot about Bellman's background, but my understanding is that he worked at the Rand Corporation and was involved in defense, right? So was that seems ironic, I don't know exactly,
Bellman actually was a very liberal guy, and in fact, he was even, there are members of his family, I think, that were under scrutiny by McCarthy during the 40s, and so he was kind of a little bit careful about what he said about his views, but he certainly was a very liberal person. He did work for Rand Corporation, but at the time, they let him and other people like Ted Harris, they just let them be mathematicians and do what they wanted to do. And but I think what happened is they started putting more pressure on them to do defense work, and that's when Ted Harris and Bellman both moved to USC, to the math department. And Bellman actually was largely in electrical engineering.
I see. So then tell me about what you did at USC.
Well, one was to observe Bellman. I mean, I had realized even when I was at Davis, when I said I was going to work for this famous mathematician, Bellman, that some of the mathematicians didn't seem very impressed, quite skeptical. And I guess that's always true, but certainly at that time, this idea of doing operations research and something that might be useful to engineering was sort of looked down upon by many mathematicians. And yet then I came to be able to work with him and see what he did, and he had such confidence that what he was doing was the right thing to do. He wasn't following the pack, he was really doing what he thought he should do. And I think that had a real impact on me in that, well, okay, I have to trust myself too. Maybe I can't be as successful as he is, but it's okay to not follow the crowd. And so that was one big impact he had on me. And the other thing was, related to this, that he was doing work in biology, and he was, as well as work on algorithms. To tell you the truth, I thought some of his work on biology was kind of superficial. That's because I wanted to go into much more detail, and he was still doing this sort of simplistic mathematical, analytical expressions. But at the time, we had no computers.
Right, no computers, so maybe, it would have been hard to do what we do today,
So when I was in graduate school, then I got really big time into social activism. So I wasn't only going to demonstrations, I was part of a small group in Los Angeles, was organizing these marches that would be tens and tens of thousands of people. And part of our job was not only to get the march organized, but to make sure that we didn't get attacked by the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, or the Cuban guys who didn't want anybody to protest against the Vietnam War. So we had all these safety devices designed and so forth, and so that took a lot of my time. And I remember one time when I had midterm coming up in a measure theory course, and I instead went to a demonstration in San Francisco, and I didn't do too well in that midterm, you know. So, and also that the whole idea of the demonstrations was that you wanted to reach the whole country, because this was early on. This was when most of the country thought Vietnam was a fine thing, that we were doing our normal good stuff. And so we had to get television cameras on us, because we were in Los Angeles. So television cameras, it's going to go national. So at one point, my colleagues and I dressed up as Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and we went around with posters, you know, saying "Stop the war in Vietnam." And sure enough, the TV cameras were there photographing us, and we were on national TV. And
do you have any pictures of that?
No, I wish I did.
It's too bad.
I did. Yes. And another time, we were chained ourselves to a church because we didn't want the police to come into the church, and so it was a certain amount of theater in it, but it was very much calculated that we have to get the message out to people, that we ourselves had gone along with the idea this was a good war, it was a justifiable war, until we looked into it. So what you're trying to do is to get other people to think about looking into it. So that took a lot of my time as a graduate student, as well as working on my research.
And Bellman was okay with that?
I don't know how much he knew. You don't exactly go in and tell your advisor you're doing all these things, right?
Right.
But certainly politically, he, I think, approved and maybe even admired me for it. So what I did, but then he knew I was interested in social issues, and so he suggested I work on environmental problem, and he had met with an ecologist, Paul Ehrlich, and there was a lot of interest in trying to use ecological manipulations to reduce pesticide use. So that would be a way of stopping environmental damage before it even occurs. And so that's what he told me I should work on. And so I went around and I went up to Berkeley and met some entomologists who were really famous in this area. And but they were doing no modeling. Or if they did, it was very, very simple modeling. And so I wrote a thesis on applying dynamic programming to these sort of pest dynamic problems, and including went out to the fields of California and marched through these fields of alfalfa and oranges and so forth to see what they were doing.
And so this was like a control process where you make decisions about how much pesticide to put on the field at a moment in time.
Yeah, or not only just pesticides. Some of the work we did was also harvesting. Like like alfalfa, you harvest many times, so you could manipulate the times of harvest so that you kill the insects, and maybe you had a slight loss in yield, but you didn't have to use pesticides. Yeah. And then I graduated and went to Cornell because of the combination of this influence from Germany and from Bellman himself. My first priority was to do something good for society, and probably in this pesticide area, and it wasn't to become a successful professor. That's not, but I had a PhD, so I went into an academic job, but the real goal was to do something practical. And so I took a job in a civil engineering department. They had an environmental systems program that had been started by Walter Lynn and was really being led by Peter Laux. And so that ended up being the best environmental systems program in the country. And so they hired me, to my surprise. I knew nothing about civil engineering, and pesticides and ecology were not part of the civil engineering program, but they allowed me academic freedom. They gave me tenure on the basis of my work in that area because the senior people and the biologists I work with were very supportive.
And there must have been, I mean, if you're doing dynamic programming applied to pest management, which I'm sure is very different from the other work that people were doing in entomology at the time. Like, was anybody else doing anything like what you were doing?
There were a couple other people who'd been mathematicians or people who'd been kind of pulled into the area. And there was two people at Texas A&M and another guy at Davis. And but it turned out not to be such a great area to be in. So since then, all those people are doing other things. It just wasn't as good as engineering in terms of being very quantitative. But I did work for some years. I stayed with it probably too long. But I did do, for example, I published a paper in operations research doing dynamic programming to this system, which is quite complicated because the insects are in all different stages and they have different characteristics in each stage. So it's kind of a multi-layer thing where I had an analytical model of the underlying ecological system in order to reduce the number of state variables in the dynamic programming problem.
And did people apply your methods in practice?
Well, not so much the dynamic programming, but I also did a lot of just practical stuff like building simulation models.
I see.
I have to say, at the time, I was rather, especially early on, was sort of really angry that I had gotten to do PhD in mathematics. I thought, this is a waste, you know? I mean, mathematics is lovely, but I can't use it for anything. What happened, the big change though, was then computers got bigger, and especially Cornell got a supercomputer center. And then that changed everything, and I could begin to really describe these complex systems as they needed to be described, and then you needed an algorithm in order to do it well. And so it really changed my whole direction from doing these very practical simulation models and a little bit of dynamic programming to really getting much more interested in high performance computing and parallel algorithms
and so what was that, did you decide one day to stop doing pest management, or did it just sort of organically, the one thing you started spending a little bit more?
It took me a long time. It was probably over a period of almost 8 years, that I would start. For one thing, you say, I'm going to leave pest management, what am I going to move into, And so I tried a few things, and then, finally the thing that paid off was I started working on groundwater contamination.
And was it that you had in mind that you wanted to leave pest management, and so you were explicitly exploring other areas?
Yeah. Also, I was in a civil engineering department, and it made a lot of sense in terms of students and everything to be working on problems that were more related to civil engineering. But I didn't want to do the same thing that other people in my department were doing. But the groundwater thing then became a new topic that they weren't touching at all, because groundwater is, you have to describe it by complex partial differential equations, and the equations take a long time to run. What these other people were doing was linear programming, convex programming, and statistics, which were low impact in terms of computation. But once you got into trying to optimize nonlinear partial differential equations, that was a whole new type of algorithm that was needed. And so I moved into that area because of the availability of these computers, and also very much with the idea of not just computing it, but doing it in parallel, and how do you do it efficiently. And so I used something called differential dynamic programming, which, unlike most types of dynamic programming, does allow you to have a large number of state variables. So actually each node in a finite element model could be incorporated in that. But in doing that, when we did our calculations, there were 98% of the time was calculating derivatives. And the derivatives we were doing analytically, I was still a mathematician, so I made my poor students had to take these complex finite element models which had multiple constituents, so your mini matrices multiplied by many matrices, and I made them analytically derive the derivatives for these, which of course were also in matrix form. And then it took 3 months to do that, or 4 months, and then another 4 months to code it, and it was really complicated. And then still, even with that, we were spending 98% of our time calculating derivatives. And I kept thinking, why do I need all these derivatives? I mean, it just seems so excessive in terms of the kind of problem I'm trying to solve. And about the same time as that, I was still doing some dynamic programming where we were trying to separate to do approximations of the state space, and which we did approximate dynamic programming about 10 years before it got that name.
Right.
We first started off with.
So when was that?
That was the first paper was 1993, which was using tensor product cubic splines, and then later I worked with David Rupert on using Mars regression, and that was in '99, and Victoria Chin. And so there I was using these approximations, which you now call surrogates. So I thought, well, why don't I try to use these surrogates to do just regular optimization, only global optimization, because genetic algorithms were really popular, but boy, they didn't work on groundwater problems either because they took too many evaluations. So I got interested in trying to do these surrogate optimization to solve things like the groundwater problems.
And were you aware of the other, I mean, it was early on, but the other work that was sort of in that area, that sort of similar area, like the
surrogates?
Yeah.
Well, the first paper I read was the ego paper.
Right.
And I thought that was such a beautiful paper. I was sort of so envious. I thought, why hadn't I written this paper?
Right.
And
Jones, Schonlau, and Welch, 1998.
Jones, yeah. 1998, right. And this was some years after that.
Right.
And but then we looked into it. We thought, that looks really complicated, doing those ego things, and we're going to use a different approach, this radio basis functions, deterministic surrogate. And even back in 2005, we compared it against ego, and we were computationally much faster. Mm-hmm. Of course, both the algorithms have changed a lot since then, but we continue to test it against ego. And I mention this, as you know, because ego, or these Gaussian process expected improvement algorithms, are very popular.
They are very popular.
But I think it's because it's elegant, and from a numerical point of view, there's a lot of things that doesn't work so well, especially the dimension gets above about 10.
Right.
And we recently did some work on applying it to a machine learning problem where you're trying to optimize hyperparameters.
Yeah.
And so most of the machine learning algorithms are based on something, an extension of ego, using Gaussian process and expected improvement. And so we compared against them with when we had like 15 to 19 hyperparameters, and we were about 5 times faster. And so I want to continue this work. I want to try to figure out why is it different. It's one thing to say empirically it's different, but to try to find out why.
To understand why. And were you always focused on groundwater management, or so when did you start thinking about? You got into global optimization because you were interested in groundwater management, and then when did you start to think about global optimization as its own thing that's interesting in other application areas? I
think I still always had the truth is I discovered that although I do have the social activism and want to do something, I also love mathematics. Right. And so, the thrill of getting thinking on a new algorithm and stuff, I feel that just like you do. And so I think I always saw it as a general algorithm. I always saw it as this is a general purpose algorithm that is applicable to classes of problems, and in particular the class of problems are functions that are probably simulation models that are computationally expensive, probably have a multimodal surface. So that for those classes of functions is what this would work on.
But you've also done, you've not just developed algorithms, but released codes for doing this, which I assume requires an extra dedication to, making the code useful, easy to use, bug-free, right? So that's also a focus?
Yes, very much, although I'm not a very good programmer, but I was fortunate enough to work with David Bindel at Cornell, and he, we had an NSF project, and he coded it up into Python. He suggested using Python because we wanted to run things on supercomputers, so you couldn't use MATLAB, but C was very hard to program in, so Python was a really good, and we made it as a toolbox, because by that point I had been publishing in this area for over 10 years. We had a lot of different algorithms that did different things. We do besides continuous optimization, we do integer, mixed integer, we do multi-objective. Right. And so we put all that into, he took my algorithms and coded it into this package with the help of David Erickson, who was my PhD student at the time. And so that package has now been out, and we've had 18,000 downloads in about 2 years. So it's really exciting to see that. And I do feel that's important, that if you're doing something complicated like that, you have to have a code to get people to use it. Right. And,
it's too complicated for people to expect people to code it up themselves and use it, I think.
Right. Yeah. And that's maybe one of the reasons why GP's been so popular.
So going back to kind of your earlier days at Cornell, you were department chair?
Yeah, actually I was thinking I skipped that whole first part, so I guess we can go back to that. So when I came to Cornell, when they hired me at Cornell, I was the first regular woman faculty member in a college of 200 men. There were some other women there, but they had jobs because of their husbands or something. So I just came in as a faculty person and was hired. And that was pretty hard. And also at the time, I had been, with all my previous work, was really supportive of civil rights and very much thought affirmative action should be used for racial minorities. It didn't really occur to me that women needed help because women got education, right? And it was a different thing. But then I began to see the pattern that for women it was also very hard. It's just that it occurred at sort of a different time in your life, primarily when there's children in your life, when you want to have children or you have to raise children, and that's what really was holding women back. And so I did a lot of work to try to recruit women into engineering, both students and then when we had faculty, working to try to help the faculty, got the women faculty organized, was on a committee. The dean was very supportive of this, Dean Street, and we got a maternity policy for women much earlier than many universities. And so that was one of my, so I still continued sort of some political activism, and that period was all within my profession. Then to my surprise, when I was just about to be promoted to full professor, and I was maybe 40, my department elected me department chairman. Elected meaning they did a poll and I was their choice, and then they went to the dean and he approved it. And so, and I sort of, got talked into it.
Did you want to be the
No, not particularly, but they tell you, we really need you, you're the best one, and it was also partly, it had to do with this idea of operations research in civil engineering, that, that you have a view that's supportive of systems engineering, and maybe some other people don't think that's important and just want to look at the chemistry and the more traditional civil engineering field. So there was a certain aspect of that.
Right.
So I did that for 3 years, and that was probably the hardest thing I've ever done professionally, because at the time, and because I was so young, at least half the department was older than me.
So when was that?
83,
right.
I think. And and I also had a young child at that point.
Right.
And so one of it was like, well, I always felt I was trying to be fair and would explain things to everybody. And then so if somebody gave me trouble, I'm thinking, is this because I'm a woman? Would he have, if I had said the same thing and I was a man, he would have accepted it, but I'm a woman and so he's giving me trouble. Right. And then I would get really stressed out by it. So it was, I think now I would be much different. I'd be much more hard-boiled and say, oh, well, some people are going to be difficult and that's just the way it is. But at the time I didn't know that. So I found that very difficult. But I think the first woman in the United States to be chairman of an engineering department was Sheila Widnall at MIT. And I think I was the second. I know of nobody else who did it at a leading research university. So it was very unusual, and especially for someone who wasn't even remotely a civil engineer. And so that was a remarkable experience. But it convinced me that I would rather not do any administration. I feel like I can do. It's hard for me to do both research and administration. I think some people are really efficient and can do it. But to me, if I do one or the other, it's hard to keep both of them going. Yeah.
And then you decided to, so after a long career at Cornell, you decided to go to National University of Singapore.
Yes. Yes, I wanted to say before going to Singapore, though, we were doing the surrogate stuff, and we did that on, we're doing it on optimization. We're also doing it with dynamic programming. And then we also, Rupert and I then took the idea into doing surrogates for uncertainty quantification. Right. So we did work where we used, used our radio basis functions to build a surrogate of the maximum likelihood function, or of the likelihood function, and then used Markov chain Monte Carlo on that. And and that was an NSF project that I had gotten. And I thought what I did that was different, I mean, not too many, at that time, hardly anybody had done that, but maybe they'd thought about it. But what I did that was different was I did optimization search first. So we got our initial points for the likelihood function by doing our surrogate optimization. So we did surrogate optimization trying to find the maximum likelihood estimator. That gave us a bunch of points in the space from which you could make an approximation of the maximum likelihood or the likelihood function, and then we had a method to go in and really focus in on the high probability region. Right. But getting that first surface so that you could actually identify the high probability region, that was really what made it so efficient. And it's like 20 times faster than using regular MC, and we got very much the same results. So that's something I'm really like, and I want now to try to turn that in one of my projects. And so I did go to Singapore. Yes. My husband and I decided to move to Singapore, and it's sort of an exciting thing to do for the kind of the end of your career. We'll probably retire in about 4 years, and it's been very interesting, and there's a lot more support for, at least I have more support for postdocs there, so I can get more things done. And one of the things I've done is I have a postdoc working on that, trying to take that earlier kind of research code for uncertainty quantification and turn it into something that's a powerful parallel tool that would run in high performance. Because uncertainty quantification, as you know, is just really, really expensive.
It's really expensive,
and so you want to be able to run things in parallel and figure out how to do this in an efficient, accurate way. So that's one of my current projects.
And you'd like to be able to release reusable code that people that just want to use it in an application context can
absolutely
can download it and just use it. Right.
We want it to be parallel to the PySoc code. In fact, it may even pull some stuff from the PySoc code to so it can be open source, and also the advantage of open source both with our PySoc code that we exist and what we have in mind with this is that people can go in and change it themselves, and because it's Python, it's fairly easy to go in and change, make their own algorithms, test out their own algorithms.
Right. And then, so what's your approach to, working across fields? Because you're in a civil engineering department, but you're doing optimization. You're doing global optimization. Which touches on operations research, touches on machine learning. You're doing uncertainty quantification, which is, I think of as statistics. It also is done quite a bit by people in the applied math community. So you have to, know people and go to conferences in 5 different areas. So
yeah, that's true.
How do you do that?
It's hard. The conference thing is quite difficult because you do feel like you have to keep in touch. So certainly SIAM and Informs and American Geophysical Union and Civil Engineers, Society of Civil Engineers, those 4 organizations I really do try to keep in touch with. But for example, this uncertainty quantification, we applied it to water problems. Right. So in fact, we had a couple. We took actually, the first was a simple water problem that was actually sort of analytical. Second one was a real case with real data that was a watershed model, a really messy watershed model. And then the third case was multiple constituents, where it was not only water but also pollutants. So that's sort of been my goal, is the motivation for the kind of algorithms I work on are that I try to do them in the environmental problems, and there's no way to solve them. It's not an LP or convex optimization problem, and then sort of do those 2 things together. And so since I've gone to Singapore, now we're working on, we have a very large data set from the city of Singapore on their water system, and we're modeling some of their reservoirs, and we're trying to look at algae, but we're also trying to look at, eventually with this huge data set we have, to look at machine learning, one of the things I'd like to do is to compare a machine learning prediction to a PDE model prediction, because it sounds like the PDE model is what we all love because it's science. There's a lot of, how water flows, how chemistry flows, that's all described. But the PDE models aren't all that accurate either because we can't parameterize them well enough. Yeah. And so the question would be, maybe the machine learning works as well, or at least is good enough. And,
right, and maybe it's faster.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think sometimes the machine learning isn't all that good. So this would be a way to
This is a way to find out. Yeah, so that's great. So we can look forward to that.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say, I'm so grateful for the professional life that I've been able to have. It was so unlikely given my beginnings, and being financed by public money to go to college was wonderful, and the people along the way who helped me. I mean, I haven't mentioned all the many students and colleagues that I hope in the written. There's a written biography too. I'll try to put the names more into the written biography. But it's just been a really exciting life, and to me, to be able to both do exciting mathematics in the operations research area and do things that I think are meaningful environmentally, and also other areas as well. Chemical engineering would probably do some applications, and it's just great.
Do you want to just, remember a couple of students that, did something interesting, or that, I mean, certainly you can't mention them all, I think.
Well, in terms of the surrogate, in terms of I did some control work with Liji Liao. That was when we started working on dynamic programming, differential dynamic programming, and groundwater. He was an ORIE student at Cornell, and he was just he was wonderful. He just took everything and sort of made it work. And then another really important person in my career was Romel Regis, who was also an ORIE student. And he's the one who agreed to work on surrogates. And at the time, surrogates were not popular, and it was sort of a risk to work in that area. And I never would have gotten started in the area without having him to work on it. And he did work on it, he worked on it very hard, and then he stayed with me for his postdoc for a number of years. So the whole basis of the stuff we did in surrogates was really through Romel. And then later, Stefan Wild, who was ORIE Cornell PhD, Romel and I actually suggested to him that he looked at, what Romel and I were working on was global optimization. We suggested to Stefan that he look at local optimization using trust regions. And so as soon as you start working in local optimization, then you can make a lot more theoretical analysis. So he did a beautiful job of the theory, analyzing the theory of that. We had one paper in SciEM, Scientific Computing, and then another one in Journal of Optimization, which actually won a SciGest award. He did just a beautiful job with that. And the idea was that we had previous work in differential feed methods had used quadratic approximations, and we were using radial basis functions, which allowed us to have a non-convex function and have it still work. And then David Erickson was a student in applied math, who was my student, but then when I moved to Singapore, he moved to David Bindel, but the three of us are continuing to work together, and he's been really important in maintaining PySot and making improvements in it. And then my current applied math student is Kyle Perline, who's working on dynamic programming and approximate dynamic programming using neural nets, so neural dynamic programming, and we have an improved algorithm for how to approximate that neural net. But he's also, Kyle has an engineering background, so he's very interested in power issues. So we've been applying it to hydropower problems, and I had a project with the Bonneville Power Authority, and so we have all this data from the largest system. Well, certainly it has the largest reservoirs, the first and third largest reservoirs in the United States, and overall it's got about 12 reservoirs. And so we've been working with that. First, he did an analysis of just the hydropower problem, and then we also did an analysis where you're combining hydro and wind, which is very important because the hydro can sort of be a battery for the wind if the wind doesn't come through. And but all that adds dimension to the dynamic programming. In fact, it's actually one of the things that we do that's somewhat unusual is the dimension of the state variable is changing from time period to time period depending on the state. And so that's just mentioning the people who are more those are the algorithm people, and then are many more students in civil engineering who actually carried those things out, and in these particular cases. Also, I should mention Tori Chen, who wasn't my student, but she's the one I did the work with and Sharon Johnson, also ORE, and I did work with them on this dynamic programming.
Yeah, and Tipaluk too.
Tipaluk, yes, right. The most recent, a very recent graduate, yes. And she did some of the extensions on our surrogate algorithms for cases where you're trying to do it in parallel. We had a simpler method of parallel before, but now we have a more elegant way. Because with parallel, the problem is how do you pick many points? If you have lots of processors, how do you pick the points you're going to evaluate? over the space. You don't want them all to be in the same place. And so that's what she worked on.
Yeah, and time war also.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's wonderful, you know, you have students who do algorithmic stuff, students who do applied things, and it's great to, I think it's an important part of your work to bring them together.
Yeah,
and really each benefits the other.
I had a retirement party this last summer, and so I thought I'd put together the genealogy, and so we got it all together, and I have 100 descendants. I was really amazed.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it was like 32 PhD students, but then they've had students too. And in fact, one of my academic grandchild is on the faculty in the civil engineering department, environmental systems.
Wow.
Pat Reed. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for talking with me. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for this interview. I'm really delighted to be able to share it.
Great.